Once again, you've entered Political Spirits, where we recognize that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. And even if it gets a bit heated, in the end, we should be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. Compromise is not a requirement. The point is to learn what we each think, and if that results in a compromise or shifting of position, that's great. If it doesn't, that's great too. The point is that we need to talk. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's talk about the fact that we don't seem to acknowledge anymore the things that we really know to be true. I'm talking about things that both the left and the right know to be true, but many of whom will not acknowledge it because it conflicts with stated political positions or because they're self-censoring to avoid being politically incorrect, as we discussed last week. What am I talking about? What is there that both the left and the right know to be true, but we still have arguments about it as if we don't? You know the kind of confrontations that I'm talking about. The one that reminds you of that old Saturday Night Live character Nathan Thurm, played by Martin Short. The character was a tobacco industry attorney who would chain smoke while nervously denying every single contention about the cancer-causing nature of cigarettes. Now consider a conversation where you assert that open immigration, allowing millions of immigrants to cross the border illegally, and then stay through lack of enforcement or simply issuing them an order to appear in court, which they routinely ignore, is a recipe for suppressing wages. You assert that the millions who cross the border illegally are doing so because they can't find work in their home countries, and are so desperate that they have chosen to make the arduous and dangerous journey across Mexico, and in some instances many more countries to the south, to get to the U.S. You argue that persons in such financial straits and willing to incur such costs are disproportionately likely to be low-skilled laborers. You argue that therefore they'll be competing against American citizens and green card holders who are legal, not illegal immigrants, of course, and that those citizens and green card holders against whom they are competing for jobs will likewise be low-skilled laborers. You make the point that the more illegal immigrants there are, the more depressed the wages for low-skilled laborers will be. That argument is undeniable, unless by rebuttal someone can show that the economy of the U.S. will grow so much more from the entrance of the low-skilled illegal immigrant laborers that the growth will exceed the wage increases lost. In all likelihood, you won't face a rebuttal that makes that showing. The reason is because the illegal immigrants' rates of pay will be so low that the argument that their entrance will then substantially grow the economy will be too hard to make. If you point out that a significant portion of pay to illegal immigrants may also be sent back to their home country for use by family members, that argument will be even harder to make. So what argument will you face? In all likelihood, you'll face a straight-up denial that illegal immigration has such an effect on wages for low-skilled laborers. You may face a claim that the point is not relevant because illegal immigrants do jobs that Americans won't do. In the case of agricultural jobs, such as picking lettuce, for example, that's a good point. But that only addresses a small portion of the number of immigrants crossing the border illegally. You may face a claim that you're making the argument for racist reasons, but mostly you're likely to face a very general assertion that you failed to account for all of the positive impacts immigrants have had on society. You may even face a nervous denial. And by the way, that argument about all the positive impacts immigrants have had on society, that misses the point, because the argument is not about immigration, it's about illegal immigration and setting a system that actually determines how many people can come, and then whether you enforce that system. You may even face a nervous denial, a la Nathan Thurm, and a bald-faced refusal to acknowledge the obvious, that the more you increase supply without an equal or larger increase in demand, the more the wage prices will fall. Everybody knows about supply and demand and its effect on prices. If record-breaking cold fronts move through Florida in the winter, and they last a long time, or the citrus farms don't get enough warning to prepare, the orange crop will be seriously damaged, and the supply of oranges for juice will fall. What happens? The price of orange juice will rise. If instead the weather for orange growth in Florida is perfect, there will be a bountiful harvest. What will happen? The price of orange juice will fall. Everybody knows it. Only an increase in the demand for orange juice equal to or greater than the increase in the supply of oranges will prevent the price from falling. Everybody knows that. Likewise, everybody knows that if you import millions of illegal immigrants, who without doubt will be disproportionately likely to be low-skilled laborers, wages for low-skilled labor will fall, or at least stagnate. The market rules. What else do we know to be true? We know that there's a point where people will choose not to do something if there isn't enough in it for them. We know that you can't hire a vendor to perform a service if you don't pay him enough to make it worth his while. We also know that people will demand more if they already have another customer taking up that time. In other words, if they only have so much time, and the time has already been taken by another customer, you'll have to outbid that customer to get the vendor to work for you. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at the social safety net. We all know that capitalism, in its absolute purest form, is simply more brutal than we can accept. We do not want and will not accept millions of people dying in the street. The argument is over how high you place the social safety net. Once you place that net, the people who partake of its benefits, in essence, have a customer. And to get them to work for you, you need to outbid the customer. So who's the customer? It's the government, the taxpayer. And here's the problem. This customer usually doesn't require the vendor, in this case the person receiving the government benefits, to do any work. In that circumstance, if the benefits are substantial, it's tougher to outbid the government. If it gets too tough to outbid the government, if the person receiving the benefits thinks this is good enough, then what has happened? What has happened is that a permanent underclass of government dependents has been created. In that case, the safety net, which was intended to protect those who fell to the bottom in the intense competition which is capitalism, instead trapped them. It didn't trap them like fish in a gill net, but rather it enticed them in like a hammock. In that circumstance, the social safety net becomes a hammock, and those who end up in it can get stuck there. Everyone should agree that that is an outcome we don't want and cannot have. The argument between left and right in America regarding the social safety net should always be where to place it so that it doesn't become a hammock. We all know that it can become one. The argument should simply be, at what point does that happen? We need to stop denying it and have an honest discussion. Next topic. What happened to the purity of rights groups? I remember a time when rights organizations were pure. They simply stood for what they stood for. They stood for what they said they stood for. Let's go back and take a look at the National Organization for Women. The 1966 Statement of Purpose of the National Organization for Women was issued for their first national conference held in Washington, D.C. on October 29, 1966. The Statement of Purpose is about 3 pages long. I'll read you just a couple of sentences that set out the core of the purpose. Quote, "We, men and women who hereby constitute ourselves as the National Organization for Women, believe that the time has come for a new movement toward true equality for all women in America, and toward a fully equal partnership of the sexes, as part of the worldwide revolution of human rights now taking place within and beyond our national borders. The purpose of NOW is to take action to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society now, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men." Close quote. I don't know about you, but I find it very hard to disagree with any of that. I suspect the same can be said for the vast, vast majority of other men in America. Moreover, the advantage of the statement of purpose was its simplicity. The goal was to create the opportunity for women to advance on equal footing with men and as part of a fully equal partnership of the sexes. It was that simple, laudable goal which was being pursued when you would repeatedly see now supporting women in public when they were subject to unfair or offensive attacks. So why do I bring up that aspect of what Now did? I bring it up because of the most obvious historical conflict between the organization's stated purpose and its actual conduct. That conflict was between the stated purpose and the way that Now dealt with the presidency of Bill Clinton and his treatment of women, most importantly his treatment of Monica Lewinsky. Now was virtually silent throughout the Lewinsky affair. They were virtually silent throughout the Paula Jones controversy. The statements from Arkansas law enforcement officers who said Bill Clinton used them to solicit sexual partners. As more and more would come out regarding the Lewinsky scandal, Now stood silent, as did most other feminists and feminist organizations. Meanwhile, as the January 1, 2007 online edition of Vanity Fair noted in an article by Marjorie Williams, Clinton engaged in the, quote, routine use of staff members, lawyers, and private investigators to tar the reputation of any woman who tries to call him into account for his actions, close quote. One of the most obnoxious examples of a tarring of one of the women by a Clinton advisor was by James Carville when he said, quote, drag $100 through a trailer park and there's no telling what you'll find, close quote. Not until Kathleen Willey, a former volunteer of the White House, went on 60 Minutes to divulge what she had said previously in a deposition, that Clinton had, quote, manhandled her during a private meeting in which she sought a paying job, that's when some feminists began to make reluctant noises of dismay. The National Organization for Women, which until then had found itself, quote, unable to comment responsibly, close quote, averred that Kathleen Willey's sworn testimony moves the question from whether the president is a womanizer to whether he's a sexual predator, close quote. Give the National Organization for Women credit for finally at least making a negative comment. But think about how much it took to reach that point. Now think about how many seconds of delay there would have been if the conduct of Bill Clinton had been engaged in by a Republican president. Simply put, the National Organization for Women stayed silent because Bill Clinton supported the policies that the organization supported, and they didn't want to jeopardize that. Regardless of what had been happening to women at the hands of Clinton, that was being exposed. Take a look at the FAQ section of the National Organization for Women's website, now.org, and you'll see that their goals are not as simple as they once were, and you'll see that they are so aligned with those of Clinton's. They now include express reference to securing abortion rights and promoting, quote, equality and justice, close quote. In support, they are much more aligned with the Democrat Party. They are no longer simply for the advancement of women. How many of you have heard of the Southern Poverty Law Center, or SPLC? If you have, there's a good chance you've heard of it because a news organization referenced it in the context of a group being named to their hate group list. When news organizations cite the Southern Poverty Law Center hate group list, or some other publication or finding of the SPLC, they tend to reference the SPLC's work in taking down the KKK to show the legitimacy of the SPLC and the heritage of the SPLC. That work of the SPLC was commendable and a major accomplishment in the advancement of civil rights in America. What those news organizations tend not to mention is that the SPLC has changed since those days. It no longer focuses on taking down the Klan and has instead focused on what it labels as hate groups or extremist groups. While the title on its face doesn't appear focused on just the right or just the left, the reality has been that the vast majority of the groups which the SPLC has labeled as hate groups or extremist have been on the right. Perhaps that's why in 1986, after the change in focus, all of SPLC's legal staff, except the founder, resigned. That is something that is almost never mentioned by the news organizations which cite the SPLC's hate group list. And incidentally, the groups and individuals that the SPLC has labeled as hate groups or extremist are not limited to those which seem reminiscent of the Klan or neo-Nazi organizations. In fact, as noted in the Daily Wire in an article by Aaron Bandler on September 8, 2016, the Southern Poverty Law Center listed in 2015 Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum and the John Birch Society as hate groups, even though they're completely nonviolent. The article references a Human Events article from 2011, which states that based on the organizations on the hate group list of the SPLC, if you, quote, state that kids do best when raised by a mom and dad, as opposed to two moms or two dads, you'll be propagating a known falsehood. Or if you agree with many therapists and psychologists who argue that a child's upbringing and early life experiences, including being sexually abused, play a major role in the development of his or her sexual orientation, you're propagating a known falsehood. The same is true if you claim that hate crime laws could lead to the arresting of pastors who criticize homosexuality. This has already happened in Sweden, England, and Canada. Or if you argue that it would be detrimental to the military to have gays serving openly. Yes, according to the SPLC, disseminating such views officially constitutes hate. Per the Daily Wire article, in 2011, National Review's Charles Cook was talking with a Southern Poverty Law Center representative and was pushing him for an explanation as to why the SPLC has not designated Occupy Wall Street as a hate group, even though a group affiliated with Occupy Wall Street had plotted to bomb a bridge in Cleveland, Ohio. The representative eventually admitted, quote, we're not really set up to cover the extreme left. In fact, if you pull up the SPLC website, you'll find the, quote, hate watch, close quote, section of the site which is labeled with this header, quote, Hate Watch is a blog that monitors and exposes the activities of the American radical right, close quote. Not radical organizations, not radical groups, but rather, quote, the American radical right, close quote. They're pretty much ignoring the corresponding groups on the left. How far overboard has the SPLC gone in labeling individuals or groups? Well, in 2015, it placed then presidential candidate and now HUD Secretary Ben Carson on its extremist watch list. What was his offense? Opposition to gay marriage. Under pressure, it later removed Carson from the list and apologized. In 2018, the SPLC settled a lawsuit filed by Maajid Nawaz's Quilliam Foundation after admitting that it had falsely labeled the organization as extremist. Nawaz and the organization were dedicated to fighting Islamic extremism, and as Newsweek characterized it in the June 18, 2018 edition, quote, the false use of the Quran to incite violence around the globe, close quote. In the settlement, the SPLC paid the Quilliam Foundation $3.375 million. That is not a nuisance payout. So maybe you think that it's not a big deal to be placed on the SPLC hate group list when you aren't a neo-Nazi group, a Klan group, a group that advocates violence, or other truly dangerous organization. Well, consider this. Since 2010, the SPLC has listed the Family Research Council as a hate group. In August 2012, Floyd Lee Corkins entered the Washington, D.C. offices of the Family Research Council with a bag of 15 Chick-fil-A sandwiches he picked up on the way there. He also had a gun and 3 magazines full of ammunition. His plan was to kill as many people as he could and then smear the Chick-fil-A sandwiches in their dying faces. Corkins told the judge in his case when he was prosecuted that he had hoped to intimidate gay rights opponents. Look to the February 7, 2013 CNN coverage of the attack for those details. The article notes that Corkins, quote, had chosen the Research Council as his target after finding it listed as an anti-gay group on the website of the Southern Poverty Law Center. The prosecutor said that if he had been successful at the Family Research Center, his plan was to go to another conservative group to continue the attack. Also, quote, a handwritten list naming 3 other groups he planned to attack was found in his belongings. Close quote. Luckily, the security guard wrestled with Corkins, but Corkins was able to fire 3 times, hitting the security guard once in the arm, and then the building manager was able to overpower him and take his gun. The SPLC still publishes its hate group list, and it still includes the Family Research Council. Perhaps the most prominent example of a rights organization was the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. The ACLU did things which rankled the public, both the left and the right, both Democrats and Republicans. For example, and perhaps most famously, in the late 1970s, the ACLU fought for the right of a neo-Nazi group, the National Socialist Party of America, to march on the streets of Skokie, Illinois. The stance was controversial and unpopular because it was a neo-Nazi group that was trying to march, but also because there was a large Jewish population in Skokie, Illinois. The ACLU recognized that free speech includes the speech with which we disagree, even speech which we understandably find repugnant. In fact, if the only speech was speech with which we agree, there'd be no need for free speech protections. The fact that the ACLU took a position which was wildly unpopular, including with much of the Democrat Party, which is the party of the left and therefore disproportionately likely to be in support of the ACLU, shows that the ACLU was pure in the late 1970s. It actually stood for the things which it said it stood for. Contrast that with the ACLU of today. The June 21, 2018 online edition at Reason.com contained an article entitled, quote, Leaked Internal Memo Reveals the ACLU is Wavering on Free Speech, close quote. The author of the article, Robbie Suave, notes that the memo states that the ACLU will weigh its interests in protecting the First Amendment against its commitments to, quote, social justice, equality, and women's rights, given the possibility that offensive speech might undermine the ACLU's goals, close quote. In other words, if the speech is against other policies that we support, we may not support the right of the speaker to engage in the speech. That should terrify every American. If the ACLU moves forward with that, our country will have lost its preeminent organization in support of free speech rights. As I said earlier, and as the ACLU recognized at least in the past, it is the offensive speech which needs First Amendment protection. The author of the Reason article states that he believes the ACLU leadership would probably prefer to, quote, remain a pro-First Amendment organization, but they would also like to remain in good standing with their progressive allies. Unfortunately, young progressives are increasingly hostile to free speech, which they view as synonymous with racist hate speech. Speech that impugns marginalized persons is not speech at all, in their view, but violence. Close quote. This is why a student Black Lives Matter group shut down an ACLU event at the College of William and Mary last year, chanting, quote, "Liberalism is white supremacy," close quote, and, quote, "The revolution will not uphold the Constitution," close quote. Campus activism is illiberal, and liberal free speech norms conflict with the broad protection of emotional comfort that the young, modern left demands, close quote. The attacks on freedom of speech on college campuses should terrify Americans because the students who are advancing these anti-First Amendment arguments, which gut the most important protections in the Bill of Rights, are potentially the future leaders of our country. Next topic. How to deal with attacks on free speech on college campuses. Much has been written about the suppression of free speech on colleges. Most of us have seen the coverage of the riots outside the venue at Berkeley where Milo Yiannopoulos was going to speak. We've heard about the placing of huge financial mandates on groups sponsoring conservative speakers with the money to be used for security in anticipation of protests or even riots by the left. We've read about conservative speakers being invited and then disinvited after protests from the left on campus. We've read stories about colleges which restrict the right to free speech to small areas on campus, in one case the size of only 3 parking spaces. Check out the organization thefire.org, that's thefire.org, for more information. By the way, FIRE stands for Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We've also seen relatively orthodox conservative speakers being labeled as purveyors of hate speech. I know I've read and watched video from some commentators, such as Professor Jonathan Haidt, predicting that the situation will improve. But should we do something more? Will the situation improve? Is there something we could do to guarantee that it gets better, or that it improves more quickly or more completely? What would that be, and who would do it? Well, let's talk about what is the purpose of a university. The Pew Research Center says that Americans are split on what they believe the main purpose of a college education to be. 47% believe it is to teach work-related skills, and 39% say it's to help a student grow personally and intellectually. I watched an interesting interview with Peter Thiel some time ago, in which he said that Americans basically view college education as an insurance policy that provides you with coverage to try to guarantee you'll get a better job than without it. I think that no matter what curriculum you pursue in college, a significant part of it must be devoted to teaching work-related skills. But I think that work-related skills does not necessarily mean something devoted specifically to a particular type of job. For example, if you're pursuing a degree with a STEM focus or accounting, you'll undoubtedly receive instruction that is to a significant degree devoted to very specific work-related skills. But what if you're pursuing an education which is not quite so technical or specifically focused on a particular career? Well, then it may be less clear that you are being taught work-related skills, but it should still be happening. We should be able to expect that a college graduate should generally be able to think more logically than the person of similar age who didn't attend college. Unfortunately, these days I suspect that our expectations would not be met. The reason I suspect that is because colleges have become less open to a diversity of thought. Views which differ from liberal orthodoxy, and these days liberal is further to the left than in the past, don't just get excluded from campus in the form of restrictions on conservative speakers, but also they don't get introduced in the classroom. Students should be up in arms about the absence of diversity of thought, but they don't really seem to be objecting that much. Whether that's because they feel like they really can't for fear of retribution from professors, or whether it's because they have no awareness or limited awareness of conservative thought, or they just don't care, I don't know. The bottom line is if you don't hear the facts from all sides, and you don't hear opinions from all sides, you haven't really thought anything through, and you aren't being taught how to analyze. You're just being told what to believe. In no way does that prepare you for a job or for life. So what can be done about this problem? I'm generally not a fan of government regulation, and I'm generally not a fan of a presidential administration issuing executive orders rather than going through the formal process of issuing regulations to implement legislation. But in this case, it does occur to me, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about it, in part because it could be subject to misuse in the future. What occurs to me is that if a college doesn't present a diversity of thought to its students, if it doesn't present them with both sides of the issues and the facts in support of each side, then the college is really not an educational institution. It is instead an institute of indoctrination to a particular political point of view. Our federal funding for colleges is not for indoctrination as to a particular political point of view. Federal Pell Grants are for attending educational institutions, not institutes of political indoctrination. Student loan guarantees from the federal government are not for attending institutes of political indoctrination. They're for attending educational institutions. So what about this idea? The Trump administration issues guidance in the form of an executive order or otherwise, indicating that in the future colleges which do not teach of diversity of thought in the classroom and through invited speakers will not be considered educational institutions and will therefore not receive federal grant money or federal funding of any kind, and student loans and grants will not be eligible to be used to attend such institutions. Could the Trump administration actually enforce such a move? I don't know. Based on what has happened as to a variety of other issues since President Trump took office, I suspect college administrators and other public officials would immediately run to the courts to try to stop enforcement of the new standard. But I also suspect that in some states, depending on which party was in control in the state house and the governor's office, the new standard would give those states more leverage to force change in colleges. I also think that those in the collegiate system with a fiduciary responsibility as to the bonds issued by those colleges would be incredibly nervous. If the revenue streams from the universities to pay for the bonds dried up because the students didn't attend, and they didn't attend because they couldn't get loans to go there, and they couldn't get the loans because the colleges were designated as not educational institutions, and they were designated as not educational institutions because those in a fiduciary capacity ignored the diversity of thought requirement, well, think about who else might be in court. Do I think this is going to happen? No, probably not. Do I think something like it is a good idea? I actually think floating something along these lines is a good idea. Colleges need to be reminded they have a duty to the public and the students and the parents that are in most instances footing the bills. Students should leave college knowing how to think, how to analyze and evaluate, not how to spout one side of our politics and just walk away from or label as ignorant or otherwise denigrate anyone who disagrees with them, rather than being able to engage in a thoughtful discussion. Any step that would make college administrators and members of the boards of governors of those colleges fearful that they might be held to account for graduating students who can't meet that standard of performance would be a good thing. Have I met your standard of performance? If so, join me next week for another episode of Political Spirits. Until then, this is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.